Welcome to today's LinkedIn Live, 7 Signs Your Executive Team is Slowing Execution Without Realizing It. If you're here, let me know. I had some technical problems last time and I was speaking for 10 minutes and people could not hear me. So I'm hoping that it's working this time. If you're here, let me know you're here and where you're from. And I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So my intention today, I always start with intention. My intention today is to help you recognize the signs, but also show you how to make distinctions about where execution is really breaking down. So I'm going to go through the 7 signs, then I'm going to show you the entire list. I want to share some examples I got from the poll the other day. I did a 3-day poll, had 61 participants. That's not a whole lot, but it was just 3 days and I didn't really advertise it. I'm going to share where people think it breaks down, and I'm going to talk about those results. And then we'll talk about where the leverage point is if execution is breaking down. So the first of the 7 signs is that, you know that I talk about this, difficult conversations are delayed. So when difficult conversations are delayed, there's many reasons why. It could be lack of training. It could be fear that someone's going to get defensive. It could be you don't feel clear enough, so you don't have the conversation. We'll dig a little deeper into that in a minute, but you know that I wrote a book about that back in 2022, From Conflict to Courage, How to Stop Avoiding and Start Leading. And in 4 years' time, I've had some major distinctions that I can't wait to share here. So the first one of the 7 signs is that difficult conversations are delayed, whether it's with the board of directors, whether it's with an employee, whether it's with a peer, a subordinate. Difficult conversations are put on hold. They're avoided or delayed until it's too late. The second the second sign that execution is slowing without realizing it, and I've seen this a lot with executives. I've seen it at the middle level too. But one of the signs is that when a leader is talking about the person instead of with the person. And part of that is what I call playing power of attorney. And that's when someone comes to you with insider information, like, here's what you need to know. And don't tell them I told you, but this is what Julie thinks. This is what Fred thinks. This is what Jamal thinks about X, Y, and Z. I see leaders falling into that trap of gossiping without knowing that it's gossiping, by being upset, disappointed, and then talking about someone instead of with that person. So a good sign that you need to be aware of that is if you find yourself talking about someone because you're upset, it's a sign that you need to have a conversation, and that's because that's going to break down your execution. The third sign is that accountability often feels like punishment in the organization. Now, I have done a lot of work around making the distinction between accountability and responsibility. If after watching this, you want to get a private video link to see the difference and why it's important that you distinguish, just direct message me the word alignment. I'll bring that up again at the end. But when accountability is only after the fact, then that becomes a problem. And if accountability is just you're in trouble, you didn't get it done, there's a problem within the system. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. And then another one is replacing conversations with policy. There was once when I was working on a project and the leader asked me if I would review their policy because they could tell that they needed to make a lot of policy changes because of the conflict that was going on. But here's what I know from years of experience, that if you can't have the conversation about what's going on right now, a new policy isn't going to create the change, because the real problem is the inability to have conversations. And then another piece, this one would be number 5, leaders react. They react instead of learning how to regulate. And this is something I think is going to be on the frontier of future ready leadership, is learning how to self-regulate. And I don't mean stuffing down your feelings. I mean noticing when you're getting triggered, when your voice is getting loud, when you're losing your ability to control the direction of the conversation. Doing a lot of research right now on neuroscience and on how the nervous system works when we don't have the capacity. And I wrote about capacity in my book, From Conflict to Courage. So when we just react, you can be a great leader otherwise, but when you react instead of learning to regulate, your conversations are going to actually not be productive, and it's going to make you risk execution. Number 6 is when expectations are assumed instead of clarified. Here's what I've realized here lately is that the more responsible you are for the outcome, the clearer you need to be. It's interesting how people can say, oh, well, we're clear. But if you're not responsible for the results and the consequences, you may only be surface level clear. And I know that as a consultant and as an advisor that I can be really clear in seeing things, seeing patterns for my clients, but I'm humble enough to know that my clarity is from an observational place where I'm watching patterns and I'm not really going to be held responsible and accountable for the results. I can offer advice, support, coaching, and help with clarity retreats and so on. But one reason it's so much easier, for consultants, and people give consultants a lot of credit, we all know the answer in a workshop. We all know the answer when our reputation is really not at stake, or when we're not going to lose our job because of it. So the more responsible we are for the results, the more important it is that we have clarity. And clarity can be difficult because we have a lot of myths that we believe in around the word clarity and around the concept of clarity. And then finally, conflict is avoided in the name of collaboration. So fake clarity creates a lapse in execution. We agree in the meeting, we agree in the board meeting, but then we're struggling to come together and make things work. That's because there's a fake agreement. We want the collaboration. We like the good feelings of agreeing, but we haven't really thought about what all this agreement is going to require of us. So I want to show you the list of this here very quickly. Difficult conversations are delayed. Leaders talk about the person instead of with the person. Accountability feels like punishment. Conversations are replaced with policy. Leaders react instead of regulating, and expectations are assumed instead of clarified. Conflict is avoided in the name of collaboration. I want to share a little bit from the poll results. So this was fun. I never do polls, but I'm going to start doing more because this was really insightful and several people direct messaged me. I asked the question, where does execution break? And this was my first poll, so it was an experiment. It was 3 days long, got 61 participants, and 51% said lack of clarity. Now, I want to ask a question. If we all know that there's a lack of clarity and that's what's breaking execution, if we know that, why don't we work on clarity? Why do we have results that we don't want, or why do we have loose ends, things that never got accomplished? 20% said avoided conversations. And I say that you have to have a conversation to have accountability, so that makes sense. So 20% said avoided conversations. I couldn't agree more. 28% said accountability. And I was surprised that the number wasn't bigger than this, because most of the projects that I've been on, or when someone's been inquiring about my work, the first place where the pain is felt is blamed on the lack of accountability. And then 2% said other. And so what I want to say is everybody's correct, because we feel the pain at different places, but I want to make it a distinction. It's conversation that is the leverage. It is either the strongest link or the weakest link. Now, I had someone, this was really interesting. I'm going to refer to my notes really quickly. Someone that's a connection of mine, Ken Lacey, said, if an organization were to poll their leadership teams on who owned what in their business, that survey might be quite interesting, particularly those that are having communication challenges. And I thought that is so true. The more if you don't know who owns the project, it's easy to say you're clear because you don't feel responsible for it. So I thought that was a pretty interesting statement there. And so I want to show you something that I've created that I think will be pretty clarifying if you're in charge of results and you feel the pain of responsibility for getting things done. I've created a model called the alignment chain. And it's really simple, but there's a lot of complexity and a lot of depth within this chain, so I want to explain it. Clarity, conversation, accountability, then execution. Where does execution break? Well, it actually breaks at every part of the chain, but the strongest or the weakest link is the conversation, the communication, not just communication, the conversation. And I hope to be able to explain that. Let me get to the next slide. When it breaks at clarity, many of us thought it breaks at clarity. that can be true. That's where we have the what I call the inner conflict. I can know that I'm not completely clear, but I have this feeling that I should be clear. So there's a lot of shame that seems to arise whenever we're not clear, especially as a leader. We feel that we're expected to be so clear on everything. But what I want to say is that often we are confusing clarity with certainty. Certainty, none of us really have. It's more of a feeling. We feel confident. We feel that our plan is going to work. Clarity can be very, very small. It can be just the light of a candle. It can be the flicker of light that tells you what the next step is. So what we have a myth that we have to be completely clear before we have a conversation, when what I want to say is that sometimes clarity comes through the conversation. So when we think that we have to be crystal clear before the conversation, we have to understand that part of clarity is through discovery, but we struggle with that because of our shame about not being clear. And we also struggle with it because we don't want the conflict. So we are afraid and we do not have the capacity to have these conversations. Now, there's a difference in communication and conversation. Communication is a memo, a note. It's me saying, here's what you need to do. I need you to complete something. I've communicated with you what's expected. But a conversation very often is a back and forth. There's sometimes a questioning, sometimes a disagreement. And I have noticed that very few of us have the capacity to actually stay in the conversation long enough to get the clarity that we need, because we become more committed to being right than staying in a conversation. Now, a lot of you know that I created a video or a online course, and it's my own, and it's called the Performance Coaching Model. And I do that, offer that within organizations in groups of 10 or more. And it's a model, it's a framework for having conversations. And what I've since realized is that you can have the skills, you can understand the skills, and you can understand the framework and where you are in the conversation. And in my model, we have the very front end of the conversation. We also have the back end of the very end result. Those two places are solid. Let me tell you what happens. The middle is messy, because that's where you're trying to think like a consultant and listen to the other person. You're trying to determine the root cause. You're trying to listen for, are they willing or not willing? That's where the conversation gets messy, and that's where we shut down because we think we have to know. But here's the reality. In a conversation about performance or behavior or any high stakes, it's going to get messy, and we sometimes get distracted, we sometimes get triggered, and then we feel bad about it. So we go back to the avoidance and the belief that we must have 100% clarity in order to move forward, when the reality is the clarity is going to come through our capacity for the conversation. Because if we are really honest with ourselves as leaders, we make a lot of assumptions about why someone isn't performing or why their behavior is as it is. And we are not comfortable, and nor do we have the capacity to have that conversation and hear them out, because we don't know that we can shut it down and say, you know what? We're getting off track. Let's talk again. That's the messy middle. A conversation is usually not linear. We want it to be. And I've created a framework where it can be somewhat linear in your understanding of where you are, but where conversation is in this link, it is either the bridge or the barrier. And so even if you're not completely clear, it is really, truly okay to say, I don't have complete clarity, but I'd like to start a conversation that may continue on. And we just haven't, as leaders, been taught this idea, and we haven't learned how to do it. Now, the next piece of this, as you can see, is accountability. I am really evolving right now, taking some downtime to really think. That's how I get my insights, is research, thinking, writing, distinctions, and I will grapple with something for as long as I need to have the clarity and even certainty to some degree of how things work. And I want to share a new insight today. I was thinking that maybe that accountability, you have to have a conversation to have accountability. I still say that. It will not happen without a conversation, but just because you had a conversation does not mean there's accountability, and here's why. The reason it does not mean that you have accountability is because accountability, number one, has been associated with punishment. And what that means is after the fact and before a conversation. Someone gets in trouble, someone gets written up, someone gets put on probation, someone loses their job, and it's called accountability. But accountability is truly about measurement. It is of the head, it is about measuring the results, not just having a roundtable meeting with everybody saying, yes, I got my part done. Did you see evidence that it was done? Was there a real measurement? Did you see the log? You see, we're so afraid of being called micromanagers that we are even afraid to ask someone, how's the project going? Because we don't know how to bake it in. And so since we don't know how to bake it in, we are avoiding the conversation because we don't want to be called micromanaging. So there's some definition there that we need to create, some clarity that we need to create, that when I ask how a project is doing and we have quarterly check-ins or monthly check-ins, that's not me managing. That is me being responsible, totally responsible as the senior leader or the VP or the CEO. I'm the one that is really fully responsible for all the results. So I have the right to know where you are. And so when we get really clear about that, we say accountability is not only about a conversation with someone that's witnessing your work, but it's also a measurement of the work. So if you're just having conversations about something, but there's no real proof of it, and you haven't really looked at reality and truth, there's not really accountability. So yes, it can break at accountability, even if you're having conversations, because the conversations were not about measurement. So I'm hoping that that's making sense because this is so big. I was talking with another friend consultant about this, and I said, it's funny. Whenever I've been on weight loss programs, back in the day when Jenny Craig was here and you would go and weigh in, I always weighed different at my own place than I did under the watchful eyes of someone else. Well, see, real accountability is about measurement, not about me lying to myself. And so that's kind of a weird example, but that's accountability is about measurement. And without that witness, without that other person that says, yes, there's evidence that you're doing what you're saying that you're doing, because otherwise you're still going to come back and have that conversation later when, S hits the fan, so to speak. So we have to understand how this alignment chain works. Conversation is the piece, but it really can fail at accountability. So what I'm saying here is that thank you to everyone that took the poll, because everybody's right. It's just that we feel it and notice it at different places, and we don't understand the strength of the conversation link. So I wrote some notes here, and I want to share this with you. And one of my notes is that we have the myth that communication or conversation is the strongest or the weakest link. And the myth is I have to be perfectly clear before having a conversation. The fact is that sometimes clarity comes through the conversation. I've already said this once, we confuse clarity with certainty, and clarity as certainty versus clarity as discovery. So if we change how we see clarity, it's sometimes discovery, because wherever you are in the organization, there's different requirements for your clarity. You may need operational clarity. You may need the clarity of mission, vision, values. So we have to understand, what kind of clarity do I need? And where am I in the organization? And what I always say is that this has helped me tremendously whenever I've been stalled. I only need enough clarity for the next right step because it will be revealed. I can't have full clarity, or otherwise I'll stall and not take action. So if you think of clarity as a flashlight or a candle, and I know the next right step, that gives me new information. And sometimes we do have a plan and we want that plan to work, but we're seeking certainty. And so I often say a plan is a guide, not a God. And so those are my thoughts on clarity and certainty. And finally, there's two kinds of clarity. There's pre-conversation clarity, which is what I'm offering in my performance coaching model. I give you that pre-conversation clarity of where to start, what skills you need, the messy middle, and what's going to happen. But you've got the beginning and you've got the ending. That is solid because you're the one making the decision. You're the one doing the talking. But real conversation has a messy middle where there's another person that disagrees or sees it differently. And so there's pre-conversation clarity, and then that messy middle is more emergent clarity, the kind that comes through the conversation. And so I want to say this in getting close to the end. We expect clarity to arrive before the conversation. We expect clarity to arrive before the conversation when the clarity itself is the path, when the conversation itself is the pathway to clarity. I'm going to say it again. We expect clarity to arrive before the conversation when the conversation itself is the pathway to clarity. I hope you've gotten value from this, and I'd love to hear from you. I only see like one person that really popped in. So I hope that there's others watching or that you're watching it later. And if this meant something to you, I'm happy to give you a PDF of the 7 signs in order so you can have them and start to look for them. And I'm really happy to give you a private link that explains, it's a video that explains the distinction between accountability and responsibility and why you need to have both and how those are separate and aligned. And so if you want to, you can direct message me, put the word alignment, and I'll send that to you. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you got value and would love to hear your insights as well.